An entire U.S. division armed only with inflatable tanks, fake radio chatter, and Hollywood sound effects fooled elite German units for months. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, a deception unit so secret even Eisenhower avoided mentioning them, waged a war of illusion that saved lives and reshaped some of the most dangerous decisions of the Western Front. They called it a war of smoke and mirrors until a man who painted stage sets and tuned radios called it by a better name: theater. Eli Mercer had never fired a gun in anger. Before the war, he'd painted backdrops for Broadway revues, mixed soundtracks for midnight radio plays, and hired himself as a caricaturist at summer boardwalks. War, he had come to believe, would decide who shot straight, not who painted well. By the time the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops rolled into Europe, Eli had learned otherwise. War could be argued with tape, light, and the human ear. They taught him to blow an engine into a horn, to place a coil of wire so it might seem an armored column lay hidden behind a hedgerow, to program the static and cadence of a radio net so well that a German signals analyst would swear there were dozens of tanks passing through the dark. The trick was never simple imitation, it was performance, an art of expectation and misdirection. Theirs was a new theater. The stage, the Breton hedgerows and the ruined French farm lanes, the props, rubber boats, scrims, inflatable Sherman jackets, and telephone wires, the orchestra, recorded engine noises, newly perfected loudspeakers, and men who listened for patterns. Their opponents were not merely soldiers, but minds honed to detect truth from lie. For every trick that failed, a heart could be broken. For every trick that worked, whole battalions lived. Eli first met Captain Halverson on a rainy day in a British warehouse, where the smell of oil and wet canvas seemed constant. Halverson had hair like a cloud of stale straw and eyes that saw measurements instead of faces. He had been a stage manager for a pre-war summer stock troupe and now oversaw a unit with doctors, sound technicians, cartoonists, and tailors. Men brought from the margins of civilian trade because imagination had become a weapon.
"You'll make a general believe he's got a regiment," Halverson said, handing Eli a roll of canvas the color of gunmetal. "We'll teach you how to make noise frightened men respect." That first week, they built a Sherman-shaped envelope out of rubber and painted its silhouette so convincingly it could sit on a slope and break an observer's heart. The tank had no armor and no engine. It folded into a crate and inflated in minutes, the seams hissing like an injured animal when the first pump went to work. A boy could roll it across a field. Yet from the ridge across the valley, with binoculars that took poor light and a mind ready to see armor where none existed, it could be a Sherman full of men. They taught radio, too. The 23rd had a library of phonetic signatures and idiosyncratic operators, old men who could make deafening, banal chatter breathe life. Eli learned to sound like a battalion commander with a cough, a tired colonel with a clipped accent, a young radio operator who had been drinking. They staged entire conversations, false coordinates, bored casualness, to conjure the presence of divisions that weren't there. The recordings were as meticulous as any symphony. Engine whine, clanking tracks, muffled voices, the rhythm of men loading shells into a turret that was only skin and air. And then there were the loudspeakers. A truck-mounted array could take a single recorded roar of a diesel and scatter it across a valley, the trick being to place it where the listener assumed the sound came from. They drilled the stereo effect until the sound of an armored column could move into a wood and leave no trace but the impression of weight. "It is not enough to fool one man," Captain Halverson told them. "You must convince a chain of eyes and ears, scouts, artillery observers, radio analysts. Make the idea contagious." Their first real test was a lonely ridge near a small French town the maps whispered was of tactical interest. Intelligence suggested German mobile reserves might be held nearby. The Allies wanted those reserves watching a phantom assembly while the real troops massed elsewhere. Eli and a dozen others set out before dawn, the sky a gray smear and the mud tasting of iron. They set up their props under a sycamore whose bark had been stripped by shell fragments. Rubber tanks, canvas camouflage, arrays of empty canisters turned into fake gun barrels. Two men painted wheel prints on the road to indicate a heavy column that had passed.
At noon, they began the radio play. A recorded officer barking coordinates, a dispatch complaining about weather, a bored radio voice rehearsing a false repair. The loudspeakers played the orchestra of moving armor. Behind them, a small detachment of real soldiers, concealed in the fold of a farm, kept watch. The Germans came in the evening, 2 armored reconnaissance vehicles and a patrol. From across the valley, through scopes that pried the horizon, the rubber Shermans looked convincingly like a staging area. The Germans halted, radioed back the impression of an assembled force, and dispatched a courier on horseback. Slow, deliberate, weighted by uncertainty. When the Germans left and the moon rose over the field, Halvorsen hugged Eli by the shoulders, as if congratulating a successful actor. "You should have seen the corporal's face when his CO suggested we had an armored division ready to move," Halvorsen said under his breath. "He swallowed the bait whole." It was not glamorous. The men of the 23rd sometimes lay sleepless in the rain, their props glowing in the damp. They were mocked by their comrades who called them civilians in uniform. But after the patrol reports came in, German dispatches misreading the terrain and moving reserves away, they began to smell victory, the quiet triumph of saving lives by making others aim elsewhere. Among the men was a lanky, coffee-stained sergeant named Marcus Ito, who had once been a film projectionist. Marcus had steady hands and a talent for timing. He sat in the back of the fake evacuation center and fed cartridges into a gramophone that played the sounds of busy ordnance installations. When observers peered through the hedges, they saw an orchestra of activity. Marcus was proud. He called himself a ghost, and the nickname stuck. Marcus taught Eli that deception lived in small, human details. One night, they mounted a billboard with the insignias of a division that wasn't on any friendly order of battle. They scattered cigarette butts and tinned food wrappers. They left smudged boot tracks and a half-rolled sleeping bag. The props needed to speak the language of real camps because, as Marcus said, arms don't move themselves. People do. We must make people. It became a game of perfecting lies until they read like truth. Eli learned to wait, to let the enemy piece together a false narrative and then reinforce it with a lie so plausible the mind refused the simpler truth. They were not immortal. Once in the Ardennes, a German artillery observer ignored the distance and unmasked a platoon of canvas tanks with tracer fire. The rubber skins shuddered, and the night filled with the sound of flapping canvas. The men of the 23rd had rigged the props to burn and collapse on cue. Still, the sound of fire among the fake hulks felt like a betrayal. A young soundman named Pete was wounded that night, not by bullets at the inflation pump, but by a shell that shattered the supply truck. He bled into the mud, like a second prop, and the men learned the hard fact that illusion could not always protect the illusion makers. Theirs was an imperfect armor. Eli folded Pete's hand into his and promised, absurdly, that they had saved more lives than they had put at risk. He whispered that to himself as well, because it was the only truth that made sense. A successful deception could divert an assault, spare a town, or spare a regiment from being routed. Secrecy amplified the burden. Their orders forbade them from claiming credit. After some operations, they vanished like the specters they made, their deeds unmentioned in official communiques. The higher echelons had a reason for silence. Deception was most potent when denied. But the men felt it as a kind of erasure. They were living myths with no monuments. It was rumored that even Eisenhower had been reluctant to put the unit's name in public statements. Whether that was true or wartime prudence, the effect was the same. The ghost army performed and disappeared. One of their grandest operations followed the D-Day landings. The Allies needed the Germans to believe an invasion might come across the Pas-de-Calais as the real armies consolidated footholds in Normandy. To keep German minds fixated on the wrong beachhead, the 23rd staged huge feints, fake convoys, dummy radio nets, and even phony headquarters complete with traffic, mess lines, and painted unit insignia. They spread the idea that a massive force loitered across the channel. Inflated tanks sat on bluffs and looked out at the English Channel like patient green horrors. Sound rigs thumped the diesel notes of large-scale movement. Old actors from the unit wrote forged orders and let them be captured in places where German scouts would find them. A German general later referred to what he thought he'd seen as proof that the Allies considered multiple landing sites. The 23rd's illusions gave the Germans permission to believe in the multiplicity. Those misallocations of force, reserves kept at the Pas-de-Calais in the weeks after D-Day, are the sort of quiet victories that do not appear on monuments. Yet they buy time in which actual soldiers can organize, and for that the men of the Ghost Army kept a ledger of small satisfactions. Eli's moment of private acclaim came on a foggy morning when a German reconnaissance unit advanced up a road studded with fake telephone poles and false tracks. They had been trained to expect a division moving through. To their binoculars, the road was a corridor of mechanized traffic. The German officer signaled his men to halt. Eli and Marcus, in the cab of an abandoned truck, played a simple radio exchange. One of the pre-recorded voices, a colonel with a gravelly East Coast accent, complained about supply delays. Another, answering from a different speaker, spoke of men weary and ready. "We move at dawn." Marcus cued the sound of clanking chains and the shudder of a starter motor. The whole valley seemed to answer. The Germans wrote their report and left. If they suspected anything, they did not act on it. Later, a column of real Allied armor passed through the same road hours later, unseen by German scouts who assumed the area was already occupied with a larger presence. Eli felt the thrill of having been invisible and decisive at once. After the war, he would recall that morning as if it were a line in a play. He had never shot a rifle, yet he had directed the arcs of thousands of men by sound alone. He had, in a sense, been a battlefield conductor, and the orchestra had obeyed. The end of the war found the 23rd increasingly disbanded. They returned to cities where marquees advertised shows they had once worked on. They opened their own studios, or became teachers, or returned to the hum of projectors. They carried with them the physical souvenirs of their trade, a shell of rubber, a microphone, a spool of recorded wire. Eli went back to painting sets. He put into paint things he had learned in the fields, the power of suggestion, the weight of partial light, the way a shadow can convince a mind of reality. He had to explain nothing. The phantom scars ran deeper. The secret that their work continued to matter was protected by silence. For years, the men were goldfish in opaque bowls, admired, but unspoken. In museums and in odd articles, small pieces of their story began to leak out. Historians and veterans groups told parts of the tale. Yet even when recognized, the 23rd remained an odd footnote, a unit that had saved lives by pretending they had murderous intent. Years later, in a small gallery in Manhattan, Eli arranged a set of canvases that looked like canvases and like maps. They were paintings of hedgerows and telephone poles and the folds of an inflatable tank. A critic called them a meditation on presence and absence. "What were you doing over there?" a young reporter asked him after the opening. Eli thought of nights spent in the rain, of the sound of fake motors being tuned to a frequency that would fool a sentry on a ridge. "We were trying to make certain people look the other way," he said simply. "Sometimes that's the best way to keep them alive." There are wars where the loudest trumpet wins, and there are wars where silence and misdirection are the only moral crowns left to men who refuse to see all-out slaughter. The Ghost Army did not score headlines with dramatic charges or decisive sieges. They earned, instead, imprecise things: delayed assaults, spared villages, a few more mornings when men woke and chewed their army rations without smoke in their lungs. Their record reads like an argument in the margins of history. Technical, ephemeral, but true. If you want to read the exact, complicated histories, there are museum exhibits and retrospectives that unpack the 23rd's methods and missions, the inflatable tanks, the loudspeakers, the recorded radio nets, and how those tools were applied across the Western Front. Their story, once buried for reasons of secrecy and strategy, has emerged into the light piece by piece. Thanks for watching. We bring you real and true World War II stories that are never heard before. And subscribe for true and unique World War II mystery stories.